All right, everyone. Hello, hello. We'll go ahead and get started here. Hello, welcome to this Lunch and Learn where we celebrate Jane Austen's life and legacy. This year actually is her 250th, so yay! A little bit about me. My name is Megan Jenkins, and I am one of the Adult Services Programmers at the Porter Branch Library. So yeah, thank you guys so much for taking the time to spend learning just a little bit about Jane Austen and, celebrating her life and all of the work that she did during her time. So, yeah, if you guys don't really know anything about Jane Austen, that's perfectly fine. This is actually going to be a nice little introductory into her life and her works then. So, yeah, thank you guys. So, we will go ahead and get started. So, I guess to start out, who was Jane Austen? Everyone, I'm sure, has heard of her and knows that she wrote like the romancy books during like a certain time period, but who really was she? So Jane Austen was born December 16th in 1775 in Steventon, Hampshire, England, and she passed away on the 18th of July in 1817 in Winchester, Hampshire. And she died pretty young. She died at 41. And the era that she kind of lived during, a lot of people know it as like the Regency era, but that was actually a sub-era of a larger era that was the Georgian era. So yeah, a little fun fact there. I didn't know that until I was actually starting to research this because I'm like, well, what's the difference between Georgian and Regency? And I guess Regency was a sub-era of the Georgian era because Georgian era was from King George, I believe, and then there's a sub that Regency that lasted within that time frame. Anywho, the literary movement that she is most known in is the Romanticism movement that was from around 1805 to the 1830s. So yeah, in romance, the Romantic movement was more or less a movement that was really into, I feel like, saturating life, making everything really colorful or having a lot of emotions and passions in writing. So, yeah. And then she died at 41 and she never married. So, when I was looking into family, we really like to look at her immediate family tree. I think that there's always some interesting things of learning not only about like who she was, but some of bits of like where she came from and her family. So this looks really complicated. I got this wonderful tree from one of our resources here at the library, the Britannica Library, the Britannica Encyclopedia. So she was actually born from George Austen and Cassandra Austen, who George Austen was a reverend, so she came from let's see, she came from like, I don't want to say like middle class, but maybe middle class, kind of like out on the countryside, but still like pretty high up there, like financially, like her family was pretty well off. But yeah, she is like one of 8 siblings, and she's the one of 2 daughters that were born from George and Cassandra. So you first have Reverend James Austen, who was the firstborn, and then a year later was George, and then a year later was Edward. Roughly 4 years later was Henry, and then 2 years after that, Cassandra, and then Francis, then Jane, and then about 4 years later was Charles. So interesting to see like the age differences with all of her siblings and kind of like the lives that they lived. I think one of the interesting ones, there's actually a couple. So I guess first I'll start with George Austen. George Austen, who was the second brother, didn't really grow up with the family too much from what I had read about. He actually had intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so that actually kind of became a like a little controversy for Austen, especially after she passed and her fame grew and people wanted to know more about her and her family. That was actually something that was actually kind of kept quiet and like hush hush was her second brother George. Um, a lot of military family as I was like researching her. So Henry, Francis, Charles were all in the military. Um, Francis and Charles specifically were naval officers and later admirals. And I found that interesting because, and I'll get into this in the next slide, but I'll touch a little bit here with people seeing Jane Austen as a wartime writer. There were quite a few wars that were going on during Jane's lifetime. And I actually think like a lot of her inspiration for writing came probably from her family, like her immediate relatives who were in the service. So, and you see that in her books with some of her characters being soldiers of one kind or another. So, yeah. I think the other interesting family member here is Cassandra Austen. That is her one and only sister, who actually became her keeper. I put in parentheses, destroyer of Jane's letters. She was also an artist. She is one of the people who made I think it was a watercolor portrait that never got finished. It's a partial portrait of Jane Austen. And basically, when Jane was nearing passing, she wrote her will and left her letters to Cassandra. And Cassandra knew that Jane was a very private person and destroyed a lot of her letters before people really got to see them. And so a lot of stuff that we have on, like, we have quite a few things still from Jane Austen, but there's a lot of letters that are lost and a lot of context to her life that I think got lost with it because her sister did not want the world to see certain sides of that. So I found that pretty interesting. And I feel like a lot of like Jane Austen enthusiasts are like, Cassandra, why? But I suppose it's like when you have like a writer who's very private and you want to respect the wishes of the writer, I suppose. I don't know. I just think so many people are like, oh, we missed on so much of her life because those letters were lost. But we still have quite a few. The Jane Austen House, which is an organization slash it's one of the it's like a museum in England of Jane Austen's, like where she had lived. They're a really great resource that has some of the letters that you can go to their website and check it out. It's really cool. Anywho, interesting fact, Cassandra and Jane never married, nor did George Austen. But I found that to be very interesting where women during that time, marriage was the business of women. And so to not be married was definitely a statement during that time. So I found it very interesting that not only did Jane not marry, which, I mean, we all, if you know her books, like she writes romances and the happy endings. And so it's really interesting that she herself did not marry, but also not if you look at like her life. But Cassandra did not marry either. So neither of the daughters of the Austens married, which I found interesting. So yeah. Some key life events. This is so broad. There could be easily a whole thing just on her life itself. So I just chose a couple of interesting ones, or just to get like a general overview. If you go to Jane Austen House's website, you could see probably a more detailed outline there. So yeah, 1775, Jane Austen came into the world. From 1787 to 1794 were her teenage writings. She started writing pretty early on, and a lot of her works, even the ones that got published, were initially written during kind of these years, or at least preliminarily like drafted, and then kind of edited later on, and they were called something else initially. So during her teenage years, she started working on works like Love and Friendship, Leslie Castle, and Lady Susan. Around 1801, her family moves to Bath. December 2nd, 1802 is probably one of the more interesting ones because she was engaged for like under 24 hours. She accepted an offer of marriage from a Harris Big Wither. Yeah. the rich brother of her friends, but the next day she changes her mind and declines the proposal. We don't know why. There's speculations. I think because we've lost so many of her letters and her probably private life writings, we may never know the answer to that. But nonetheless, she was engaged. She did have like men interested in her life throughout her life, but she just never got married. That was not in the cards for her. That's not what she wanted. January 21st, 1805 was a big day and year for that whole family, especially for Jane. Her father passes, which kind of, after like the father passes and the family, it, like, especially for women, that can be a very unstable position, because now the women in the family that were not married became dependent or would have to rely on another male relative, which at the time would be probably the older brothers, although she did end up moving with a different brother. I can't remember when. With their brother Frank and his wife in 1806. They moved to Southampton. So Jane, Cassandra, their mother, and friend Martha Lloyd, they go and they live in Southampton with her brother Frank and his wife. So yeah, by 1811 to 1816, those were the years that like she really started publishing her pieces. She started really cranking out those books by that point. Most of her works were published by then, with the exception of 2 that were done after she passed. I believe 6 months after she passed is when the last 2 were published. But yeah, that's when like those main like Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, like that's when all those books started coming out, was really between that 5-6 year time period. By April of 1817, she started growing ill and it started getting worse. And that's kind of when she wrote her will to leave all of her writings to Cassandra. There's been speculation on how she passed. She passed away July 18th, 1817. There's no real clear-cut answer, as like illnesses back then would be diagnosed differently now. So I believe modern census is like Addison's disease, perhaps. That's kind of the main speculation at the moment. But yeah, this is kind of just like a very brief overview of her life, and something that I wanted to add alongside that, because sometimes we look at these historical figures and we kind of have to like, we forget, or we don't really think about like what other worldly events were happening during that time, like alongside this person's life. And so what makes Jane interesting is that she was around for not only the French Revolution, which did pretty directly impact her, as I believe her mother's side. She had friends and family in France during the French Revolution, and not all of them made it out. But yeah, the French Revolution and then the Napoleonic wars were happening during that time. So during the French Revolution, Jane was between 13 to 23, because that was about a 10-year time period. And then Jane was 27 to 39 during the Napoleonic Wars. So throughout most of her life, she was alive during war. And so that, and you can see that subtly in her writing. I think some critics will say like she didn't really talk about it, or she just wanted to like have it all fly over. Other people will say that was very intentional. So I don't know, just either way, very interesting. So sometimes when we look at these people, we're like, where did they actually live? But also the books, you wonder like, where did they actually take place? And so I saw this map on the Britannica Encyclopedia, or Encyclopedia Britannica, and I thought it was really cool, so I figured I'd share, where it's a map of England, and you have Wales as well, where you can see kind of what inspired or where the events in these novels took place, along with where she lived. The two starred ones, you have Steventon, Hampshire, and then Chawton, Hampshire. But I just thought it was really cool because not all the places in Austen's novels are real, but there is general, and if you go to jasna.org, you can see maps. They look a little different than this, older maps, but you can see pretty detailed maps of these fictional cities where they were closely at for real cities, but you can also see the real cities and places that inspired Jane Austen or what she created. So I just thought that was a fun little map to share. So now we'll kind of dive in, just briefly going through all of her works. I feel like most people, like the big one is Pride and Prejudice, but she wrote in a total of 6 novels, and then she also had some short stories and unfinished pieces. So I'm just going to kind of go over the 6. Looking back in hindsight, I didn't think to include all of her other pieces. So I really just have the main 6 here. So we'll start with her first, Sense and Sensibility, that was published October 1811, but it was initially written in 1795 before her 22nd birthday. So a lot of her works, or at least her earlier works, she had already kind of drafted and written a good time before she started publishing. I believe she wasn't first published until she was 34, 30. I think it was in her 30s, I believe, was when she was first published, if memory serves. If not, apologies. But yeah, so she initially wrote Sense and Sensibility before her 22nd birthday, and it was actually called Eleanor and Marianne in like the early development stages. Most likely due to the fact that the main characters are Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood, which I took the synopsises from Austen House and Britannica Encyclopedia. I think they do a great job like kind of summarizing what it's about. So for Sense and Sensibility, the story centers around 2 sisters, Eleanor, who is considered sense, and Marianne, who's considered sensibility, Dashwood, as they come of age. After the death of their father, they are forced to leave their family estate and to move with their mother and younger sister to a cottage in rural Devonshire. The story charts their experiences in love, loss, and a growing understanding of the world, themselves and each other, playing in particular on the internal conflicts between the qualities of sense and sensibility that each sisters display, kind of thing. So yeah, this was her first piece. So yeah. Her second one, the most notable one, Pride and Prejudice. I feel like we've all seen like the movies or the adaptations or readaptations rather, or reinterpretations and whatnot, or retellings. This one was published January 13th, but initially written when she was around 22, 23 years old. And it was first called First Impressions. I thought that was really cute. I'm actually wondering, like, perhaps to follow on the alliteration of Sense and Sensibility, wanted to keep that Pride and Prejudice. But I think First Impressions is a really cute name. So I just thought that was cute. But yeah, the story centers around the Bennet family, whose 5 unmarried daughters are not in line to inherit their family estate and must therefore marry to secure their livelihoods. The heroine, Elizabeth, or Lizzie Bennet, champions the importance of marrying for mutual love and respect rather than for wealth or status. Britannica Encyclopedia notes that the character has incisive wit and superb character, which I think Austen's novels, a lot of people will say she is very witty. And I think we can see that with her characters a lot of the time, obviously, but just it gives you a little tidbit into the life of who Austen was, rather. So yeah, I don't know, very cute. Mansfield Park, I did not see if there was an alternative name for this one, so I think it was just called Mansfield Park, and it was written May of 1814, initially drafted between 1811 and 1813. So I feel like she's starting to catch up now with writing and then publishing. But yeah, so for Mansfield Park, the story follows the young, poor protagonist Fanny Price, who at age 10 is sent to live with her rich aunt and uncle Bertram. Sorry, there we go. Bertram and their grand estate in Mansfield Park. Growing up in their family circle, Fanny navigates love, loneliness, and rivalry. So with Mansfield Park, it takes on the broader themes, including landscaping, religion, theater, and marriage, and it touches upon colonialism and slavery as part, at least, of the family's wealth that is kind of shown to come from a West India estate. I guess that's listed in Chapter 3 in Antigua. So Britannica describes this as exploring moral questions, emotional intricacies, and human flaws with a demure protagonist who observes keenly and feels deeply as she confronts privilege, principle, pretense, and propriety, sometimes experiencing painful moments when it was all wretchedness together. I really liked how Britannica kind of summarized that. But also, I feel this is such a side comment, demure. I feel like that word in recent years has been like completely like turned into something. And so anytime I see it now, I'm like, but yeah, Mansfield Park is her third novel here. So yeah. And now we move on to Emma, which Emma is the last novel that would be published during Jane's lifetime. So this was the last one that she herself would see published, and that was done December 1815, initially drafted the year prior, around the same time that Mansfield Park was being published. So she was really just like writing and like pumping out these books, like very, very impressive with how much she wrote during her lifetime. She really was a consistent, like disciplined writer, I feel like, because it can be hard to write a book. But yeah, set in the fictional village of Highbury, the story focuses on its handsome and clever and rich heroine, Emma Woodhouse, who entertains herself by matchmaking and meddling in the lives of her friends and neighbors. Emma is the only one of Austen's heroines who does not need to marry for money. However, the themes of female dependence, marriage and class, and the lack of other possibilities available to women are still prominent. I really like how the Jane Austen house summarized that, because during that time, like I said at the beginning, woman's business was marriage and who you marry and the finances of it and marrying for finances. That was very, very much prevalent, prominent in 19th century British, or 19th century England. So yeah, this is Emma, the last one to be published during her lifetime. Northanger Abbey, and then as well as Persuasion, both of these were published at the same time after she passed. It was about 6 months after her death in December of 1817. For Northanger Abbey, initially it was called Susan and Catherine. And this one, the initial draft is possibly as early as in 1794, so pretty significantly earlier, but was completed around 1798 to 1799. I'm not sure why this one was held up for publishing compared to the others, but for whatever reason it was, and it only came into light after she passed. But yeah, so the story follows Catherine Morland, a 17-year-old daughter of a country clergyman who is now in training for a heroine. Leaving her village home to enjoy a season in Bath, Catherine embarks on a series of adventures, encountering romance, friendship, fashion, and social ambition. Catherine is an ardent reader of Gothic novels and at times lets her imagination get the better of her, but as the story progresses, she learns to distinguish truth from fiction. And for this novel, it tackles themes of marriage, social ambition, reading, taste, and the picturesque. And throughout, it explores satire, satires of the graphic novels of terror that were so popular in the 1790s. So Britannica just basically says it's a satirical coming of age, and it is sounds very cute. It sounds definitely like for people who enjoy books. I actually didn't know how popular Gothic fiction was during that time and still until I started doing the research for this, and apparently really was. So yeah. So Northanger Abbey was the first 2 volumes of a 4-volume publication for December 18th, or December 1817, my bad. And the last 2 was Persuasion. These were in like volume sets, so I actually think of manga when I think of this, where the novels that we read today of these books came out not as like the full one book, but came out in like almost half sizes. So for Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, that was a 4-book set, but Northanger Abbey was the first 2 books, and then the last 2 books were Persuasion. So when we look at like the one book today, back then it was actually volumes, and I like to think of manga when I think of that, because manga has the volumes, but sometimes they'll come out with like an omnibus, which is like a thicker version. So that kind of combines some of the volumes together. Neither here nor there. Persuasion was published, again, December 1817. There wasn't any indication that I could find of when it was possibly written. So I'm assuming it was just sometime throughout her life, the later part of her life. But yeah, the story follows Anne Elliot, Austen's most mature heroine at 27 years old. I kind of want to pause there for just a second, because when you look at her previous works, these are all characters in their late teens to early 20s, whereas Persuasion is by far, I think, her most mature work, with having a protagonist at 27 who's unmarried, which at that time, when we look and think about that like Regency era of England, it was not really a common to see women in their late 20s unmarried or never married. Whether like having a widow would be one thing, but to have never married at that age was almost like a social pariah type of situation, where it was not common. Single women were very invisible during that time. Just an interesting fact, I wrote my thesis on single women during that time, and so to see a book that was written and published kind of in that time frame of a main character who's a single woman in her late 20s, I just found that to be fascinating. So yeah. She's unmarried, having 7 years earlier been persuaded to break off her engagement to Frederick Wentworth, a promising young naval officer. And again, that naval officer, I feel like she very much could have had inspiration from her brothers, whom 2 of them were not only naval officers, they became admirals. So very interesting to see how she uses her most likely like real life experiences and observations of occupations and people in her family to inspire her work. When the Elliots rent out their family estate to try to reduce their debts and expenditure, Anne is thrown back into the company of Captain Wentworth, who is home on leave. The novel deals with themes of love and loss, regret, second chances, pride, and ambition. It is also with a deep love of sea of the Navy, which makes passionate plea for the strength of unrequited love in women. I think Britannica says it best, where it's really a second chance story, where you kind of have a protagonist who talks about like regret and whatnot. It's actually the book I'm reading now, which I find very interesting. And one of my favorite lines, I think by far, I've only just started it, but in one part she says, it sometimes happens that a woman is handsomer at 29 than she was 10 years before, and, generally speaking, if there has been neither ill health nor anxiety, it is a time of life at which scarcely any charm is lost. This was talking about the main character's sister who was 29, but I found that line to be so interesting because it was so it was very contradictory to what society was telling women at the time, and I feel like to what women hear today. So yeah, very interesting. And yeah, otherwise that is like those were the 6 main pieces that she had. Now she did have other unfinished manuscripts and short stories. Like I said, I did not get to include those in this, and I'm like, but there has been like the Watsons, Lady Susan, and quite a few others. So I would definitely say, if you're ever inclined, definitely check those out. So let's move on to Austen's legacy. So her works obviously were her legacy, but why? So who cares, essentially? And this is where I wouldn't say she was the first romance author at all, but she was definitely the first romance author for that time that made romance to what it is today, kind of being the one to make the romance genre in that marketable, like massive, like public, I don't know, popular interest perhaps. But she also gave the novel its distinctly modern characters through the treatment of ordinary people in everyday life. I'm not quite sure how ordinary, given that she did come from some wealth and could afford to kind of live out her days writing and whatnot. But with how many people at the time really adored her novels, and even how you see it still stands the test of time today, she really knew how to create these really real characters that people could really relate to. And perhaps the biggest one, vividly depicts like English middle class life during the early 19th century. I think this is a huge reason why people who love history really gravitate towards her works, because even though these are fiction pieces with made-up characters, sometimes in made-up towns, the accuracy and just the historical references were just so like spot on. And it gives like a really interesting picture of the times, essentially. And as Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote in 1870, Miss Austen understood the smallness of life to perfection. She was a great artist, equal in her small sphere to Shakespeare. And I thought that was a very interesting quote because she has been often compared to Shakespeare in her own way, with her writing and the significance and contribution to English literature specifically. Her works define the era's novel of manners, but they also became timeless classics that remained critical and popular successes for more than 2 centuries after her death. Yeah, I mean, you see, and we'll get into that in a few moments in the next coming slides, just how impactful her storytelling, her writing, and her characters are, because we still see adaptations and retellings today of her works. So yeah. But yeah, overall, Jane Austen House says her name is a byword for wit, social observation, and insight into the lives of women in the early 19th century. She is celebrated as a social observer, a moralist, a comic genius, and as a popular and universal writer. It's all quite an achievement for the younger daughter of a country rector who completed her formal education at the age of 11 and was never publicly acknowledged as a writer during her lifetime. Something to note about her works is that her works were never said by Jane Austen. Her first novel, Sense and Sensibility, was simply said written by a lady. And then future publications, it was author of Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, or XYZ. It was never by Jane Austen. So, yeah, very interesting note there. So, hot takes. These are just my personal hot takes. um, just some like little observations that I came across. Although I'm sure a lot of people would agree, and I'm sure the first one, especially like the lives of women, Jane Austen gave a voice and perspective into the lives and minds of women during her time that paved the way for future discussions and discourses surrounding women's rights and their placement in English society. Um, a lot of the conversations surrounding women and their placement in society didn't come until like a few decades after her death. I think that's when the conversation really started to take off, as there was a huge surplus of single unmarried women compared to the ratio of eligible men during the time, due to men going off into wars, men going off into exploration, traveling, or colonizing. There was a huge surplus of women, and no one knew what to do with them. And very fascinating to read up on early feminism and how people would discuss on what to do with all of these single women. So yeah, that was something I looked at when I was doing my master thesis, and I was like, oh wow, but that wasn't really like a huge discussion during Austen's time. It was beginning to, but it didn't really pick up till after. But a lot of people would go back to Austen's works and kind of see kind of Austen's influence, so to speak, on these people. So yeah. Taylor Swift. This one's a fun one, but as I was looking into Austen and the publishings of her works, I noticed that a lot of times I feel like she was a lot like Taylor Swift. Jane Austen fought for her publication rights and was very adamant about owning her work, or owning like a majority of the rights to her work. Even if it meant she had to take on the financial risks, which would mean sometimes publishing on commission, like with Sense and Sensibility. She published by commission for that, but with Pride and Prejudice, she gave the copyrights up like outright. So it was really interesting to see her as a businesswoman negotiating and really like taking like firm stances on owning her work, so to speak, which was, I mean, not only were writers in general during that time like didn't really own the rights to their stuff, let alone women. And oftentimes women writers would get really exploited because of that. And so it's really interesting to see that. And I think of like the modern example, Taylor, with like owning her masters and whatnot. I just thought that was like such an interesting like correlation to have. And then Bridgerton, which I realized, oh my gosh, the slide actually did not save. There we go. Sorry about that. So yeah, I went ahead and paused, and then oh, sorry about that. Sorry, I went ahead and fixed that. So for Bridgerton, in season 3, though that series is a very popular Netflix series that is set in Regency time loosely. Though in season 3, episode 1, when Eloise is reading what she says is Emma, Emma actually wasn't published during that time. So I believe the series begins around summer of 1815, but Emma wasn't actually published until December, until that winter. So that was like a fun little Easter egg that I had come across as I was just looking into kind of some of the modern takes of Jane Austen's works, or what inspired future works, or who Jane Austen inspired for future works. So yeah. An interesting memoir would be Jane's nephew after Jane Austen passed. This was about 53 years after her passing, and people grew very much more interested in her work because though she was never really given like, I don't know, like awards or really accolade or recognition for her being a writer, I feel like much like other people that have come before and after her, a lot of her notoriety and fame came after she passed. So as interest grew in who this amazing writer was, one of her family members, her nephew, along with some of his sisters and relatives, created a memoir of Jane Austen that was published in 1870. Which an interesting note about that would be the memoir was very much written with Victorian sensibility, omitting details such as the existence of Jane's second brother, George, and Jane's aunt, who I guess had a trial for theft at one point. The family were also concerned to gloss over any hint of romantic attachments. So for all of its shortcomings, however, the memoir with its precious firsthand insights is a very valuable source, which has informed all subsequent biographies. This is from the Jane Austen house. So I was like starting to read through some of it, and I thought it was very interesting. You have these people who have first like eye account witness of this person. So yeah, I believe her nephew was about 12 to 13 when he passed, or when she passed, sorry. So he was pretty young, but it's still interesting to see, like, I'm sure the stories he's heard and also just interacting with other family members as well, because she was on the younger side back in, like, the immediate family tree. I neglected to mention most of her family lived until, like, their 70s, 80s, and one even, I believe, was 90 something, I think, if I kind of peek back here and check. Frances Austen, 91, the fifth brother, yeah. So yeah, most of them lived until their 70s, so she actually passed away fairly young compared to the rest of her immediate family. So yeah, getting to see this memoir be released after the fact that we have something like this to kind of have someone who had first eye account witness of her life is pretty interesting. So yeah. Influences on modern art and literature, adaptations, retellings, and more. These are just some of the movies and TV shows that were made in the past few decades. So very interesting to look at. There's also been a whole bunch of books that to this day you still see adaptations and retellings of Jane Austen's work. So yeah, very interesting. And a lot of these you can actually check out at the library if you'd like. So yeah, if you're further interested in reading more about Jane Austen, specifically, we have a couple of new titles or recent titles that I'd recommend. You have Jane Austen's Bookshelf, Jane Austen, the original romance novelist, Jane Austen's Christmas, and A Jane Austen Year, which I myself have been looking at A Jane Austen Year. It's created by the Jane Austen House in celebration of her 250th anniversary, which I found to be really nice. It goes through each month of the year, and each month has like a different focus that I find very interesting. Like for November, had a lot about persuasion, because Persuasion, the book itself, is kind of considered like a very autumn wintry book, which I kind of like that. That was really cute. So yeah, overall, we do have some upcoming events here at the library if you guys are interested. We have one of our big teas coming up. But as far as what's coming up, even just this weekend, we have pop culture trivia at the Salem Church branch. Oh, my bad, Fredericksburg, correction. At the Fredericksburg branch from 2 to 4. That's Saturday, December 13th. So if you guys want to do some crafts and pop culture trivia for Jane Austen, highly recommend that. And then at the Salem Church branch on Monday, December 15th, there's Real Crafty, Sense and Sensibility, 1995 movie. The feature film's going to show with the lights on, and you can bring in a craft. So if you're into like crocheting or knitting, you can come in, watch Sense and Sensibility while working on your craft. So, and then Tuesday, December 16th is actually Jane Austen's birthday. And so at the Howell branch, there's going to be the Jane Austen's 250th birthday celebration tea. So if you bring a teacup, you can come celebrate Jane Austen's 250th with Regency-inspired tea and refreshments, costumes encouraged. So you guys, if you guys are interested in signing up for any of these or attending, feel free to scan the QR code at the lower right-hand corner, or if you go to our website at librarypoint.org/events, you can type in the event that you're interested in attending, or feel free to stop by any of our branches and ask. But yeah, those are going to be some of our upcoming events just to celebrate Jane Austen's 250th anniversary. Thank you guys so much for spending time with me today to kind of talk about Jane Austen, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.